All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. I hope that you're doing well, that you had a great weekend and are ready to rock and roll into the next one. I believe we're on week 10 of the semester. Can't say it really feels like that, but I have to say I'm very much so excited that things are rolling along, and I'm really looking forward to graduating at this point. Let's kick things off. I have a lot to brief you on, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. This past week, I signed on, along with my fellow Big Ten student body presidents, a statement in support of and in solidarity with the Asian American and Pacific Islander community following this past Tuesday's attacks at the in Atlanta, Georgia. My heart goes out, of course, to the victims of this shooting, and I cannot reaffirm how strongly this student government and ideally student governments of the UPUA in the future stand against racism and bigotry in all of its forms. We really need to utilize our platforms to stand up for those who are affected by issues like that, especially for students, APITA students who at the university don't feel necessarily supported or like their leaders listen to them or will stand up for them. And that's exactly what we intended to do here. This past Friday, Lexi and I held a spring executive town hall, which was pretty exciting. We got to answer some students' responses. We talked a little bit about COVID and what we can expect with the coming semester, as well as what commencement might look like for the class of 21, as well as the class of 20, considering that they really got the short end of the stick. We also touched briefly on the blue and white-esque spring practice, which first year students will have access to. And I think what was really nice was answering a few questions, kind of reflecting on this past year. I'm sure many of you have by now seen Vice President Pathicle's remarks and reflections that she might have given herself if she, to her 8-year-old self from Onward State. And it was a really great time to reflect there as well. So very much so feeling that sort of nostalgia at this point in our terms. And I want to thank Onward State for offering that opportunity. This past Saturday, in place of our regularly scheduled cabinet meeting, we held our first Executive Policy Council. Now, this is a relatively new structure that we built this year. It's technically housed within the Executive Office of the President, but what it does is looks to break away from some of the broken traditions of the UPUA in the past. Historically, the UPUA president and vice president run on a laundry list, as we've called it, of ideas, all really set to be delegated to the Assembly of Representatives, who are each, all of those representatives are elected on their own platforms as well. Those initiatives are then typically written up on our whiteboard, and it's, the direction of the Assembly that the president and vice president want to take. And I think what Lexi and I really wanted to do this year was separate the difference between our opinions and helping elevate those of the representatives themselves. And so not once did we really ask anybody to do, any sort of initiative of our own. If there were representatives who wanted to help out, that was the goal. But this forum served as an opportunity to go over our, if you will, partisan ideas that Lexi and I ran on with the cabinet and talk about what actions can be taken if it were held earlier in our terms, to get the ball rolling. But in this case, really to get the ball, to keep the ball rolling now that, our terms are coming to a close. And invitations to the legislative branch's steering committee were made available too. So representatives have the opportunity to see kind of what we want to do without us necessarily continuing that dangerous trope of just urging them, really just telling them to do what we want. That's not ever how we saw the rules. Some recent legislation from the Assembly that I was happy to sign on Sunday includes Resolution 5515 in support of zero waste commitments from University Park student organizations. The resolution calls on all student orgs, including the UPUA, to dedicate itself to waste reduction and achieving zero waste within the next decade. Sounds like a long time, but you'd be surprised how difficult it might actually be. The process should include delineating specific waste reduction goals and targets with actionable steps outlined to do so. Specifically, organizations should aim to achieve waste reduction goals of 80 to 90% diversion in the next 5 years. And in the following 5 years, efforts should be undertaken to achieve complete zero waste status. The Department of Sustainability for the UPUA's case is really the entity that's been heading up our efforts to ensure that that commitment is lived up to here in the UPUA. But organizations are also encouraged to make that commitment themselves. And I'd be interested to even see perhaps how some of your own organizations could jump in on that bandwagon towards zero waste. Another one was Resolution 5615, relatively big one, calling on the Pennsylvania State University to completely divest from fossil fuel holdings. This follows really in accordance and in tandem really with a lot of student government action and advocacy across the country. It says that, on behalf of the UPUA and the University Park undergraduate student body, and in recognition of the environmental, economic, and ethical consequences of the fossil fuel investments made by the Pennsylvania State University, the UPUA calls on Penn State to really do three things. One, freeze all future investments in fossil fuels. Two, immediately construct institutional targets to sell all holdings in firms that extract, produce, refine, sell, store, or transport oil, gas, and coal by December 31st, 2026. And three, redirect these investments to wind, solar, and other forms of renewable energy with an emphasis on a just energy transition for frontline communities and displaced workers. It goes on to suggest that, or not to suggest, but it goes on to say that the UPUA implores Penn State to further align with the Penn State Code of Ethical Values, integrity, responsibility, community. The UPUA acknowledges the financial and health burden on Pennsylvanians caused by fossil fuels and calls on the university to completely divest from fossil fuel holdings as a method of enacting climate justice, racial justice, and economic justice. It urges the university to, at all levels of government, including the Board of Trustees and the University Investment Council, to respond with a public comment to the state of Penn State's fossil fuel divestments and include a summary of all future plans for divestment. And then lastly, calls on the Student Trustee Selection Committee to heavily emphasize the value of sustainability and potential candidates while selecting their next student trustee, specifically by preferring students who are knowledgeable and actionable in the domain of sustainable development and investment. Quite a lot there. What I want to make sure that people understand is that when student governments and really any organization calls for the divestment of fossil fuels, something that can't be left behind is this idea of a just energy transition. Pulling out immediately all of our investments in really any facet could have really drastic impacts on the communities that really live, especially in Pennsylvania, on that sort of work, right? It's going to ultimately, there's going to be a front-end cost in helping train some of these workers to find new homes in renewable energy and in industries that enable us to leave a greener future rather than one which unfortunately might not. And that's what the UPUA made sure to include in this ask. But I'm interested to see how the university responds. We still haven't heard a response from the university, so what I'll probably do is send a follow-up after this resolution has already been sent, and see if see when really they'd like to provide that public comment and see what more there is to do. Some bills. Funding for sexual violence awareness and prevention, 2021 tabling. This is pretty procedural. We have historically put on SFAP, as it's known, tabling events to help really get students the resources that they might need to learn about how to prevent sexual violence and raise awareness of the problem. This will be held on Tuesday, April 6th through Friday, April 2nd through Tuesday, April 6th on the Hub lawn from 11 to 3 p.m. To raise awareness about events on campus and get those resources out. And lastly, there was a policy which added some revisions to the UPUA bylaws and operational code, really just helping solidify some of the maybe confusion and controversy that was there with liaisons in that appointment process. Some upcoming legislation that the UPUA will consider on Wednesday includes some pretty big policy changes as we wrap out our terms in this assembly. Policy 1515 regards the expansion and clarification of the judicial board's election processes. I can't say I'm too familiar with this one. I know that Chief Justice Zia and Speaker Zhang worked pretty extensively on this, but I do know that it would work to really institutionalize the UPUA's election efforts and getting out the vote much earlier on than we do. Right now, as it stands, the judicial board, a whole branch of the UPUA, serves as the elections commission, but that moniker doesn't really take form until elections start to come around. And so, we're left with this mixed bag of one, low voter turnout. We're left with low candidate turnout, as we're seeing this year. And at times, some people don't even seem to know, how to get involved in UPUA elections and things like that. So hopefully what this would do is solidify that in the judicial branch, there exists both a Supreme Court and an elections court. I thought at first maybe the Supreme Court would be a little much. I know that the USG, our predecessor, used to have a Supreme Court. And I guess I might have found it funny that people would walk around calling themselves the Supreme Court Chief Justice. But all the same, I guess here I am as president, and Stephen walks around as speaker. So, if it makes sense and it helps getting out the vote, why not? The elections court would work year round to help ensure that those things are achieved: high voter turnout, high candidate turnout, and that sort of informational events happen year round. Pretty simple. Policy 1615 implements changes to the Constitution recommended by the Ad hoc on Organizational Structures Executive Branch Subcommittee. This is, I think, by far one of the most impactful pieces of legislation that the UPUA will consider in terms of internal changes, other than perhaps creating the cabinet and the executive director structure for the exec branch. This is a subcommittee that I chaired throughout the past year. We met really infrequently, thanks to COVID and a variety of things, but met nonetheless to talk about changes to the UPUA that would work to ensure the necessary continuity of the student government from year to year. As it stands, UPUA representatives, the president, have terms which are pretty undefined. And I say that as in they're defined by election day to election day. That's how long they last. But then officers also can't take office until reciting the oath of office, which is usually a week. And in this case, it'll be 2 weeks after election day. So for those days, that week or 2 weeks or however long, there is no student government. There's no elected student representative group or body. And it really obviously halts some of the progress which we've put in if some events, even like SFAP tabling, are set for right after election day. This policy would work to clarify that so that representatives and elected officials, if you'd like to call them that, elected students, terms last from the swearing in after election day until the next individual taking the office takes the oath of office. Simple. You're a lame duck after election day, but why that hasn't been solidified is beyond me. It's pretty common sense, to be honest with you. The other big one deals with the executive branch terms and executive staff members, department members, even legislative committee coordinators and committee staffers, judicial board clerks, entities that aren't elected but are rather appointed or even hired by specific subsidiaries of the branches. And it clarifies in the Constitution that the heads of the branches can leave these individuals in the branch should it be at their discretion to do so. The president currently has the ability to remove really anybody in the executive branch at any time. And so one could make the argument that they should also be able to keep that member on board if they are doing good work and are not seeking to leave. Let me give you an example. If you have the records department set up the way we did this year, where you have a group of students who are considered digitization specialists, These people are literally just going in and scanning documents from as early as 1906 through as late as 2019, 2020, from the student government's history and making them digital. Eventually, what we'd like to do is create, as I've talked about before, this history site and make it all accessible to the public. So why you would immediately remove a member who is just sitting there doing this kind of a digitization, it's important work, it's not busy work, but it's, I think in the eyes of some representatives, busy work, from their office, just because representatives' terms are up, makes no sense to me whatsoever. It clarifies, this policy clarifies that executive directors follow similar term lengths as representatives, considering their high stature in the executive branch. They serve as the president's cabinet. But at the same time, it allows the president to essentially keep that member on board so long as they reapply the same as any other person would, I guess, as it stands right now. And that allows for the creation of a cabinet on day one. There's no reason why a president and vice president shouldn't have a cabinet until the end of the summer, which is essentially what would happen if this policy fails, because the first UPUA assembly meeting was pushed back a week. The first UPUA assembly meeting creates the steering committee by holding internal elections. And then the first steering committee in which you can hold an interview for a cabinet member would be the following Sunday. And by that point, you're looking at the fact that the semester is almost over. So all in all, it allows the president to have a support system on day one, and in many ways, the organization have that support system on day one. Same thing goes for records as well as social media outreach. Why we should abandon our posts if students are reaching out for us to us for help and looking to get connected with, I don't know, maybe the faculty senate or the board of trustees, even me or the incoming president. Under the current understanding of some representatives, there wouldn't be anybody to fill that spot. Nobody is there to manage anything. And yes, there is no student government and there's a total chaos. How we've done it before is pretty, unfortunately, similar to the chaos that I'm describing to you now, only that the executive branch was not as large as it is now. So your social media director, for example, might step down because in the case of last year, they worked on an opposing campaign and they might just not wanted to work with us. That was totally fine. But if there's somebody who does, we feel it should be the president's discretion to really keep it up and going. And that continuity should be there to ensure that the student government can continue to work rather than be caught flat-footed for the next few months. I actually can't stress to you how important that is. As it stands right now, it sounds like quite a few people, if not upwards of 50 people, could be immediately removed from the UPUA who aren't elected officials, but who are rather like the bureaucratic people working on records and social media, who are working on research projects in the Department of Sustainability, whatever have you, who are student and organizational rights advisors. It's interesting to me because SORA advisors actually have never been held to the same standard. They've always just been able to be kept in the UPUA. So why it's all of a sudden a big problem now is beyond me. But as you can imagine, I'm pretty hopeful that passes because it ultimately, I think, would do a lot of harm to the student body to see it not pass, and certainly a lot of harm to the student government. And I hope that that's not ultimately what happens. Policy 1715 creates a student referendum on divestment during the 2021-22 election. This is directly following the footsteps of Rutgers University, who had a referendum come up as well, in which the student body indicated that they fully supported divestment. We did pass the resolution saying that we would support it, but having the student bodies, as we've talked about before, a participatory student body in which they can also have a say directly, and it's not just us. We can push aside the idea and notion that it's our own political beliefs or partisan beliefs. It's a shame that you would even have to say that, but at the end of the day, the students will have an opportunity to share their voice should this pass, and there'll be a little question on the election day ballot for you to select, yes, I think we should divest. No, I don't think we should. Resolution 5715 establishes the test prep week of spring of 2021. We have quite a few leftover test prep books, MCAT, LSAT, GRE, what have you, sitting in the office, and I want to make sure that we get them back out to our students. So I've worked with the AAC committee to ensure that that is going to come about, and I'm grateful for them taking the leadership and putting the resolution forward. That will take place March 29th, should this pass, March 29th through April 2nd. Again, a weird scenario where nobody's really in office. But ultimately, we, like I said, want to make sure the students get those books. And Resolution 5815, which calls for the addition of a diversity, equity, and inclusion resource tab to the University Park interactive map. There are quite a few resources available on the header for that map right now, but one which doesn't exist is a diversity, equity, and inclusion resource tab, which would highlight things like the Center for Gender and Sexual Diversity, as well as clothing transits for students in the LGBTQ community who really just might need some direction to find some of those resources, which we have. I believe that's about it. Quite a lot there. I guess I can only say that this weekend I was also very grateful to make it out to the Osaze Osagi March for Justice, in which we visited the site in which he was murdered, his home. Heard quite a lot of stories of individuals who knew him, and it highlights, I think, many things, but two which stand out to me, of course, the most: racial inequities seen within the various systems here at Penn State College and across the country, as well as the need for getting those services and resources, especially with regard to mental health, out to individuals who need them the most. That's kind of what we've been trying to preach here in the student government, and that I hope that in the future, in situations like that, it's not a police officer who's responding to that call, but a mental health professional. And I was also able to make it out to the vigil put on Sunday night, honoring and remembering those who were lost at the shootings in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was very moved to hear the students and community members who spoke up, and in many ways called for us to use our platforms as necessary to ensure that, you know, we're calling out racism and xenophobia as we hope to continue doing. I'd be happy to take any questions if you happen to have them. But it's really great seeing everyone. Ryan?
Hi, Zach. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what some of the policies were or what was discussed in the town hall that you hope to transition into the next assembly, and kind of what those discussions were like leading into the next few weeks.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. Well, one of the things that we talked about were some of these high priority items that we've spoken about before, things like sexual assault and climate action, which really need to be continued on in the next assembly, were brought up, ensuring that future administrations find really, it's going to be hard to inspire that innately, as much as we'd like those individuals and any individual to take the roles, to want to do those things automatically, but finding ways to ensure that the student government commits itself to those things will be important. We also touched on we touched briefly on some discussions regarding anti-racism training. I don't believe that was explicitly in the town hall, but in recent conversations, finding how we can integrate that into our UPUA procedure as well, as we've done this past year. We want to make sure that that's not a one-off thing, but something rather that we continue all the time. We did lastly touch on the creation of What's Up, which is a work in progress now. If you couldn't tell, we have quite a lot of things to finish up in the last week or so. So we're really trying to sprint at this point. But What's Up is a very similar idea to a referenda in that the student government will put out a survey to the entire student body and more or less just ask for their opinion on various things, gauge their interest on things. You know, if it's as simple as the student government is taking, these are some of the resolutions that the student government has supported. You know, I support these on a scale of 1 to 10. Please respond. Just some way of getting greater data on our students and really data on their preferences so that we can represent them as best as possible and continue creating that participatory environment. Ethan, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Zach. I just have a quick question in kind of on lieu of the referendum. I was wondering about the student referendum on divestment. When exactly would this referendum go up during the election? Would it be on next Wednesday, the 31st, or in like the time between the votes being counted?
Great question. It would go up on the 31st. The ballot is an online tool. I believe it's actually through Org Central, so it's relatively easy to add a question or a candidate, whatever, to the ballot, and it'll be up on the 31st. I think the results would then be in the same time that the candidates are in, since it's all electronic. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if you have the time, you know, definitely try to come out to tomorrow's last assembly meeting. I think we're going to try to take a group photo of some kind of the representatives and really anybody else who'd like to come. I can't stress to you enough how important I think some of these policies are in really continuing, frankly, in continuing the student government. You don't see new presidents of the United States take office and immediately boot everybody out of the Department of State or the Department of Defense because they're doing important managerial work that is different from representatives. They're there because they're the student experts, and so why you kick them out just to have them prove their mettle again is not only just illogical, but in many ways disrespectful to them and their hard work. So if you feel the same, feel free to speak about it. But I'd be happy to share any other concerns or I guess answer any other questions in another time if you have them. Thanks so much for meeting today, and I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. Today's Tuesday. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.